I'm Jake. I live alone in a small, quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It's a peaceful place, trees line the streets, the houses are well kept, and the neighbors keep to themselves. I like it that way. I've always been the type of person who enjoys solitude, the comfort of knowing my house is my own sanctuary. My home is small but cozy, with a big window that overlooks the street. Every morning I sit by that window, sip my coffee, and watch the world go by. It's a routine that gives me a sense of calm, a quiet rhythm that makes me feel at ease. But one evening, after a long day of work, I noticed something odd. A new neighbor had moved into the house across the street. I hadn't seen them yet, but the buzz around the neighborhood was impossible to ignore. People whispered about him, saying he was different, quiet, mysterious, a bit off-putting. He didn't seem to mind the gossip. In fact, I never saw him at all for the first few days. He was a ghost, or so it seemed. I wasn't particularly curious about him, but I did wonder what kind of person would move into a place so isolated. I thought about it briefly and then dismissed the idea. I was used to my quiet life. What difference did it make who lived across the street? Then one evening, everything changed. It was around dusk, the sky tinged with orange and pink, and I was sitting by my window as usual, watching the day fade into night. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was standing in his front yard, just staring at my house. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for something, maybe a package or a friend. But the longer I looked, the more unsettling it became. He didn't move an inch. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me, or rather, on the house. I shook my head. I must have been imagining things. Maybe he was just a guy who liked to keep to himself, I reasoned. So I shrugged it off and went back to my coffee. But as the days went on, it got stranger. Every time I glanced out my window, there he was, standing in the same spot, staring. It was as if he had made a habit of it. His presence had become a part of my daily routine. The same time every evening I'd look out and he'd be there, just standing. One day the curiosity got the better of me. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe he wasn't as strange as I was making him out to be. I decided to go across the street and introduce myself, clear the air. After all, what's the worst that could happen? I walked across the lawn, my shoes crunching against the grass. When I reached his door, I knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness and I waited. The door creaked open and there he was, standing in the doorway, silent. His expression was blank, his eyes cold and distant. "Hi, I'm Jake. I live across the street," I said, forcing a smile. "I just wanted to introduce myself and welcome you to the neighborhood." There was no response. He didn't even acknowledge my greeting. He just stood there, staring at me, his face unreadable. I tried again. "Is there anything you need? I can help if you're settling in." He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving me. After what felt like an eternity, I awkwardly mumbled something about having to go, and I turned around, heading back to my house. That night I couldn't sleep. From the silence of my bedroom, I heard strange noises drifting through the walls. Scratching. Faint at first, but distinct enough to make me sit up in bed. It wasn't the sound of furniture shifting or the wind rattling the windows. It was something different, something deliberate. Scratching, then silence, then more scratching. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Maybe the pipes were making noise or the walls were creaking. But it didn't feel like that. Felt wrong. The next day I saw him again. He was standing in his yard just as before. But this time something was different. He wasn't standing still anymore. He was holding something in his hand, something long and sharp. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it gleamed in the fading light of dusk. A knife? A long tool of some kind? I froze, my heart pounding. I couldn't look away. It was like some invisible force was holding me in place. The sharp object reflected the dim light, glinting in a way that made my stomach churn. I felt like I was being pulled into something dark, something I didn't want to understand. But there he stood, motionless as ever, his eyes never leaving my house. I didn't know what to think anymore. That night, the strange noises came again. Only this time they were louder. Scratching, followed by a thud, followed by silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house with him wasn't just him. Something was wrong. Something was off. The reflection in his window caught my eye the next time I looked across the street. I saw him moving inside. But it wasn't him. Not exactly. His reflection was walking around the room, moving in ways that he didn't. It was as if something was using his form, mimicking him, but it didn't quite get it right. The movements were jerky, unnatural. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the realization hit me. The man who had been standing in his yard, who had been staring at my house, wasn't the person I thought he was. It wasn't him anymore. It never had been. Panic flooded me. I reached for my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. "You need to come. There's something wrong with my neighbor. I don't know what's going on, but I'm telling you, it's not him." The officers arrived soon after. They were skeptical but followed me across the street. But when we reached his house, everything was eerily calm. The lights were off. The windows were closed. It was as if no one had ever lived there at all. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. No sign of life. They opened the door and went inside, and when they came back out, they had no explanation. The house was empty. No sign of the neighbor. "There's no one here," one of the officers said. "This house has been abandoned for weeks." I stood frozen, the words hitting me like a punch to the stomach. "But I saw him. He was here. Just yesterday." The officer nodded slowly. "We've had reports of strange sightings in this area. People have mentioned seeing things, figures in windows, shadows moving when no one is there. But no one has been able to confirm anything." I couldn't believe it. How was this possible? Was I losing my mind? Or had I really seen something that wasn't supposed to be seen? As I walked back to my house, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me from across the street. But there was nothing. Just the empty house. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something, or someone, was still out there. That night, I made sure to close the curtains, lock every door, and keep the lights on. I couldn't sleep, not with that nagging sense of unease gnawing at me. The scratching sounds from across the street were still there, faint but persistent, as if something was trying to get in. Or out. I haven't seen the neighbor, or whatever he was, since that night. The house across the street remains empty, but I still hear the strange noises from time to time. Sometimes late at night when I lie in bed, I feel as though I'm not alone. I can't explain it. It's like something is watching me from the darkness, lurking just beyond my sight. And I know it's only a matter of time before it finds its way back. I still don't know what really happened with that neighbor. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a figment of my imagination, a trick my mind played on me. But then I remember the reflection, the way it didn't match the movements. And I know what I saw. That thing is still out there. Somewhere in the shadows, waiting. And it's watching me. My name is Mark, and I've always been a pretty laid-back guy. I'm in my late 20s, work a regular 9-to-5 job, and lead a pretty normal life in a small suburban town. Nothing exciting ever really happens to me. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or anything paranormal. Life to me is routine: work, eat, sleep, repeat. But this one evening, something happened that completely changed my perspective on everything. It was a chilly fall evening around 9 p.m. when I decided to walk home after work. The streets were quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of the day long gone. I liked the silence at night. The world felt smaller somehow, less chaotic. My office was just a few blocks away from my house, so I often chose to walk instead of driving. The cool breeze felt refreshing against my face, and the streets were empty, with only the occasional rustling of dry leaves tumbling along the sidewalk. As I walked down my street, I noticed a man across the street who seemed to be staring at me. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was just waiting for a bus, or perhaps he was lost. It wasn't uncommon to see people walking around at night, even if the streetlights seemed to make everything a little more eerie. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His stare felt intense, unnaturally so. I shrugged it off and kept walking. Maybe I was just tired from work. But then, as I walked a little further, I glanced over my shoulder. And there he was again, walking slowly behind me. Not too close, but not far either. His steps were deliberate, almost like he was pacing me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe someone else out for a late-night walk. But then I realized he wasn't just walking. He was following me. I quickened my pace, and so did he. My heart rate sped up as I heard his footsteps matching mine. They were slow but unmistakably there. The night air seemed to grow colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel my body go tense. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But the longer I walked, the more I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in my gut. I looked ahead, hoping to get to my house quickly. The streetlights blurred as I picked up the pace even more, but the man behind me didn't change his pace. I glanced back once more. This time he was closer. Too close. My stomach twisted in panic. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was following me, and he wasn't making any effort to be subtle about it. When I reached the corner of my street, I turned quickly, hoping to lose him in the maze of the quiet residential neighborhood. But as I glanced back once more, I froze. He was there, right at the corner, standing still, staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth twisted into a grin. It wasn't a friendly grin. It was unsettling, almost predatory. A chill ran down my spine and my heart raced. I didn't even think. I ran the rest of the way to my house, the sound of my shoes pounding against the pavement drowned out by the thudding of my own heartbeat. I reached my driveway, fumbled with my keys, and finally shoved the door open. As soon as I was inside, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I stood there for a moment, my breathing ragged, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to peek through the blinds, praying I wouldn't see him again. But there he was, standing at the end of my driveway. He was still watching, still staring, motionless. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I tried to steady myself. What did he want? Why was he following me? My mind raced, but there was one question I couldn't shake. How did he know where I lived? I had never seen him before, never interacted with him. But somehow he was here, watching. I couldn't stop staring back at him. His eyes were cold, unblinking, but the grin, God, that grin, never left his face. It was as if he was enjoying my fear. A sudden wave of terror washed over me. I should call the police. No, I should do something. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. My mind was in a fog. I had no idea what to do. I was trapped in my own home, staring out at this stranger who knew where I lived, and yet I couldn't even begin to understand why. I stayed there, motionless, behind the blinds, too afraid to take my eyes off him. I don't know how long I stood there. Hours maybe. Felt like a lifetime. But eventually I had to blink. And when I opened my eyes again, the man was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last. Even though he was no longer standing at the end of my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see his eyes in my mind, wide, unblinking, watching. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I didn't see the man. I didn't hear any strange noises. I convinced myself that it was just a random encounter, that maybe I had overreacted. But the feeling that something wasn't right didn't go away. Every time I walked out of my house, I checked my surroundings, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. But he never appeared. Days passed and things returned to normal. I tried to forget about the man, tried to put it out of my mind. But there was always this lingering sense of unease. A feeling that I wasn't alone even when I was surrounded by people. It was like he was still watching me. Then, a few weeks later, I found something on my doorstep. It was a note. Just one line written in messy handwriting. I'm still watching you. My blood ran cold as I stared at the note. It wasn't a prank. I knew that. It wasn't a joke. This man, this thing was still out there, watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live like this. Every moment was filled with paranoia. Every corner I turned, every street I walked down, I half expected to see him again. I had to leave. I packed up my things and put my house on the market. I didn't care about the cost, about the inconvenience. I just needed to get out. The night I moved out, I saw him again. He was standing at the end of the street just as he had the first time. His grin was still there, his eyes still wide and unblinking. He didn't say a word. He just stood there watching me as I loaded my car, watching me as I left. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I never called the police. I knew they wouldn't do anything without solid evidence. But I didn't care about that anymore. I just needed to escape. I moved to a new town far away from that place. But every now and then I wonder if he followed me. If he's still out there watching me. And sometimes when the wind howls through the trees at night, I think I hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. And I wonder, will he ever stop watching?
Hi, I'm Sarah, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me last year. Still fresh in my mind like it happened just yesterday. I'm 24 years old, a college student, and like most students, I have a pretty busy schedule. Late-night study sessions were a regular part of my routine, so I often found myself taking the last bus home after long hours at the library. I never thought anything of it. The bus was usually quiet, just a few tired passengers nodding off or quietly staring out the window, much like me. But one night changed everything. It was a Friday, the end of another grueling week, and I'd stayed late again to finish a paper I'd put off for days. I wasn't in the best mood, but I was looking forward to getting home, kicking off my shoes and relaxing. The bus was nearly empty as usual. The streets were quiet and almost deserted, except for the occasional car speeding by. I boarded the bus, found an empty seat and sank into it, tired from the long hours of work. As the doors closed and the bus began its route, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. The The kind of sensation that told you something wasn't quite right. I brushed it off though. It was late and I was just tired. But then something caught my eye. There was a man at the back of the bus. I hadn't seen him get on. He wasn't there when I boarded, so I must have missed him. The bus had barely started moving when I noticed him. He was sitting alone, hunched over in his seat, staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and locked directly on me. I felt an unsettling chill creep up my spine. I shifted in my seat, trying not to look at him, but it was impossible. There was something wrong about him. His long, unkempt hair hung in greasy strands over his forehead, and his coat was dirty as if it hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was gaunt, and his eyes, those eyes, they didn't blink, just stared. No matter how I shifted or looked away, I could feel his gaze on me like it was drilling into me. I told myself it was nothing. Just a man minding his business. He was probably a little eccentric, maybe homeless. People like that take the bus at odd hours. But my heart was racing. I could feel sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I moved to the front of the bus, closer to the driver. The air felt thick, like something was about to happen. I told myself to relax, to calm down. But when I glanced back, the man was still there watching me. His eyes never left me. My pulse quickened. The bus continued down its usual route, the streetlights flickering as we passed. With every stop I glanced at the man. He didn't move, just stayed where he was, his eyes locked on mine. The other passengers were oblivious, lost in their own worlds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, not in the way I should be. The man didn't speak. He didn't do anything except sit there staring. And with each stop he seemed to inch closer to me. He was still far at first, but slowly, surely he started to move. The sound of his slow, deliberate footsteps on the floor of the bus made my heart beat faster. He was moving step by step toward me. I tried to convince myself that I was just overreacting. He wasn't doing anything. I was just being paranoid. But then, as he reached the row of seats in front of me, he stopped. And he just stood there. I could feel my breath catching in my chest. I was frozen, unable to move, unsure of what to do. I couldn't even look at him anymore. I was too scared. His presence was suffocating and I couldn't breathe. Then it happened. The man took another step forward, so close now that I could feel his cold, stale breath on the back of my neck. His face, inches from mine, was pale and sunken, his eyes still wide and unblinking. My heart was pounding in my chest and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Then he spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked, but it carried through the silence like a chilling breeze. "You're going to die tonight." I froze. My blood ran cold. I felt the words slither through me, wrapping themselves around my insides. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. I wanted to scream, to get up and run off the bus, but I couldn't. I was trapped. My body was paralyzed. I couldn't understand why he said it or what it meant, but I knew one thing. I wasn't safe. Not anymore. Just as the words left his lips, the bus suddenly jerked to a stop, the lights flickering. I turned to the driver, hoping he would do something, but he wasn't moving. His head was slumped forward, unconscious, or maybe something worse. I didn't know. But what I did know was that I was alone with this man and we were stuck in the middle of nowhere. The doors wouldn't open. The emergency button didn't work. My phone had no signal. I was trapped. I could hear the man's breathing now, slow and deliberate, filling the silence between us. My pulse was deafening in my ears, and my vision started to blur from the panic. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, as suddenly as it had all started, the lights flickered again. The bus started moving again. I could hear the hum of the engine, the soft sound of tires rolling over the road. I looked around, confused, desperate to understand what was happening. The man, he was gone. He wasn't there anymore. The seat he had occupied was empty. The bus was moving again like nothing had happened. I rushed to the front to check on the driver. He was sitting upright, his hands on the wheel, eyes wide and alert. He looked at me like nothing was wrong, as if the whole ordeal hadn't just occurred. He didn't remember the man. He didn't remember the lights flickering. He didn't remember me, frozen in fear, unable to move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even make sense of what had just happened. I stumbled off the bus at my stop, my legs shaking beneath me. I couldn't wait to get home, to lock the door, to forget the horror I had just witnessed. But I couldn't forget. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was hallucinating, if it was a sick prank, or if something darker was at play. but the words he whispered, "You're going